Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the 2020 remake of the 2003 first-person shooter 13. This remake was developed by PlayMagic and published by Microids for PC, PS4, and Xbox One, with the original game, of course, being developed and published by Ubisoft and released for PC, PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, and Mac. And that one released in 2003, and frankly is still actually a pretty solid game. It still holds up reasonably well, even though it does have some jank to it, and it does have some design issues that were still issues back when the game originally released, but over time they haven't aged especially well. That said, overall, the original 13 actually still holds up pretty well. It had a very unique styling to it, with the whole cel-shaded graphics and the comic book stylings, all of which are still really cool and unique to this day. This remake, on the other hand, well, when it originally released, it was a ridiculously buggy, poorly performing mess with a distinct lack of PC-specific features, things like no FOV slider or anything like that. And over time, they did throw out a few patches, and the game is definitely much more stable now. It doesn't have anywhere near the amount of glitches that you saw in the original release, so things don't constantly spaz out quite like they did in the original version. And it does certainly seem to run better, although that's not really saying much because the game still has pretty severe frame rate drops, just out of nowhere and for no discernible reason. So, at the very least in its current state, it is no longer the total dumpster fire that it was on launch day. They do have things like the FOV slider in there now, and it is, for all intents and purposes, a playable video game. And of course, just because it's playable doesn't mean it's actually any good. The AI is still incredibly stupid, basically brain dead. A lot of the time you'll be standing right next to them and they won't notice you're there. You'll blast their buddy standing next to them and they'll not notice. It's just absolutely pathetic. And moreover, there's still all of the hallmarks of this being just a really shoddy, really haphazardly slapped together release. Like when you shoot an enemy and they just slowly slump over instead of falling over more dynamically like they did in the original game. Or the occasional odd but not game-breaking glitch like when you're wielding dual pistols and you use the grappling hook, the left pistol will somehow disappear and you'll just be holding your hand out there and occasionally moving it when you go to shoot, but you won't subtract any rounds from that gun because it's not actually shooting, so it gets weird when that happens. There's still all kinds of weird issues with the sounds just not playing, and even though you would expect sound effects to be there, they never are. Like when you go to use the mounted machine guns, and when you manipulate the action to ready it, there's just no sound at all, even though there should be a good ka-chunk sound going on. And a good chunk of the game you're just going to be wandering around to the sounds of absolutely nothing at all, because there's just nothing playing in the background, no ambient noise, no music, nothing like that. And as such, the only sounds you're going to get are when enemies are talking, or when you're shooting at things. So even though it is certainly in a better state than it was on launch, it's still an absolute mess, and that's to say nothing of the fact that this is a remake of a game that really didn't need to be remade in the first place. The original 13 certainly had its issues, but it was still a pretty solid first-person shooter in its day, and it still holds up very well for the most part. Sure, a lot of what makes it interesting is the comic book aesthetics that it's going for, and it pulled off extremely well, and there really hasn't been another game since then that managed to pull that off in the same way. But even if you put the aesthetics aside, the game was still a pretty solid first-person shooter, although it certainly had a fair few issues, namely things like the pretty crappy stealth system. The original PC version is still readily available on digital distribution, both Steam and GOG, and it's not a difficult game to get running at all. You just basically install it and play it. There's not really much you have to do to it. Which, of course, leads to the question of, okay, if it's still solid and it still works just fine and it still holds up pretty well, why even remake it? And that's a question I really can't answer. I don't know why they thought they should remake the game. If they were going to remake it properly, then it would make sense to smooth out some of those rough edges, like actually make the stealth system halfway decent, or remove the instant fail stealth sections, or make the boss fights better, or something like that. But that's not what they did with the remake of 13. What they did was slap together a really god-awful first-person shooter with brain-dead AI that's even dumber than the original game, and you ultimately end up with something that is not just worse than the original game, it's a downright pathetic first-person shooter. Even simple things like the sound effects are just absolutely terrible in this remake, even compared to the original game, which still didn't have the best sound effects, but the guns still actually felt pretty beefy. They had a good amount of recoil demonstrated on the screen, they had some pretty beefy sound effects, and when you launched the rockets at enemies, for example, then it would shake the screen around and you'd see the border of the screen show up, when in this remake, not only are the sound effects absolutely pathetic for the most part, the animations themselves are also pathetic. It's like a complete amateur put them together. It doesn't have any of the style or charm of the original game, and the redone graphics actually look considerably worse, which is legitimately impressive considering that the original game came out in 2003 and it actually still looks pretty good, even though the graphics do certainly look like they've aged quite a lot. But that's the kind of thing that can happen when you have a game with a really striking and well-done aesthetic. Even as the graphics age and they start to look more and more dated as time goes on, they don't look bad because the aesthetics manage to make up for that. And thus you end up in a really weird situation where a game that came out in 2020 with considerably more advanced graphics tech than the original game that came out in 2003 looks considerably worse. The crappy, amateurish animations certainly don't help there, but overall the game just doesn't look very good, it doesn't sound good, and it certainly doesn't play well. Not only did they not make any improvements to the gameplay mechanics of the original game, they actually made everything worse, not just because the AI is so much dumber, but because the weapons themselves basically have no recoil, they all are basically laser beams, and the only threat the enemies actually pose to you is that they tend to be pinpoint accurate from across the map. The end result is something that's just really boring at absolute best, and all it really makes you want to do, if you're familiar with the original game, is just play the original game again. Because despite that game's problems, not only does it just hold up reasonably well on a mechanical and aesthetic level, it just has a lot of soul that manages to shine through its issues, unlike this remake, which has no soul at all. So sure, the remake of 13 is certainly in a much better state now than it was on launch day, but that doesn't mean anything. This game is still absolutely worthless. If you want to play 13, then just go pick up a copy of the original game. Not only is it going to be cheaper, but it's going to be a hell of a lot more interesting and a hell of a lot more fun. Because all this remake does is serve as a prime example of two things. First, you really shouldn't remake something that doesn't really need to be remade in the first place. And second, even if you are going to remake something, definitely don't do what PlayMagic did when they made this pile of garbage. A properly done remake is going to carry forward what the original game did well, and hopefully even improve upon that, and it's also going to smooth out the rough edges that the original had. If it had issues, it's going to address those issues. It's not going to make them worse like this remake did. So, if nothing else, hopefully this remake serves as a prime example of what you should not do as far as remaking an older game goes. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.